I went to a petrol station at the Tesco's in Watford on Sunday night and I paid £1.76 per litre to fill up my Mazda MX-5. It cost me just over £71 in total to fill the car that would normally cost no more than around 40 quid. What's crazy is I was actually quite pleased with £1.76 as I paid £1.85p per litre just a few days before at a petrol station in London, which is ridiculous when you put that into context, as just 2 years ago during the pandemic I paid 99p per litre when demand for petrol was much lower. This is probably the biggest fuel crisis I've lived through in my lifetime, and at a time where the cost of living is already a major concern for many people, it makes me feel incredibly sorry for anyone who has to drive for their job. With this in mind, when will prices decrease? Well, to understand this, we first have to know why we're in this mess and what can be done to get out of it. How's it going, people? Welcome back to the channel and welcome to a video on the highly topical issue of fuel prices being at record highs. If you like this kind of content and want to see more like it, please do hit the like button and comment down below to let me know how the fuel crisis has impacted you. Make sure to subscribe as well if you're new here. Without further ado, let's get into the video. If you're watching this video, you're probably living through this right now, but for future generations that find this video from out of nowhere, here's some context. Prices of petrol reached a record high on Sunday the 12th of June 2022 at 185 pence per litre, with diesel coming in at 191 pence per litre. Compared to June last year, it costs around £22 more to fill up a small hatchback, £25 for a family hatchback, £30 for an SUV, £35 for a large estate, and £40 for a 7-seater. In the context of a cost of living crisis, this has huge implications for the majority of people, particularly anyone who drives to work or for work. So why are fuel prices so high? Well, as you can probably imagine, there are multiple reasons. The first is pretty simple. The price of crude oil has gone up, which is basically the foundation of petrol and diesel prices. But why has crude oil gone up? Well, at the start of the pandemic, when we were using way less petrol and diesel, the prices of crude oil dropped massively. The price per barrel was around $60 beforehand, and the lack of use dropped it down to around $18, which is just ridiculously cheap. In fact, it hadn't been that cheap since around 2001. Petrol companies were ordering 15% less crude oil in the first place to make fuels, and this properly hit the oil companies, as you can see. Since then, as the world has returned to some kind of normality and we're back all using our cars and going on holidays and ordering lots of packages and going out to buy stuff, etc., the demand for crude oil has increased massively to a point where the suppliers can't keep up with the demand, so the price per barrel has increased to around $120 by the start of June, more than 6 times the price it was at the start of the pandemic. When you add on the war in Ukraine, the situation gets even worse, as sanctions by the US and many other countries mean that Russia can't support the supply and demand equation by adding their own barrels into the mix. Russia is the world's 3rd largest producer of oil behind the US and Saudi, and it is the world's largest exporter of oil to global markets and the 2nd largest crude oil exporter behind Saudi. Basically, Russia is very important in the global oil world, so sanctions against them increases the supply shortage, meaning the supply-demand ratio skews in the direction of demand outstripping supply. Now, some would mention the fact that only 6% of the oil we use here in the UK is from Russia, but that doesn't really matter. We are at the mercy of global oil markets, which are affected heavily by the issues caused by Russia being excluded from the many supply equations. Hence, there is no way that we or anyone else could escape the increase in global oil prices. This is not all that factors into our petrol price equations though. The cost we actually pay is dictated by 6 key factors. 45% is the cost of petrol for the suppliers, so that means crude oil production, etc. 29% is the price of fuel duty, which is the tax on fuel imposed by the government. 17% is VAT, although VAT is actually charged at 20%, it makes up 17% of the price per litre. 7% is the cost of biofuel included in the petrol. 2% is the profit for the retailer factored in so they can make cash on the sale, and 1% is the cost of supply and delivery. And what's crazy about those 6 factors is that many of those 6 can affect the others. So for example, if the cost of petrol for suppliers goes up, then their cost of delivery goes up and it will cost more to fill up their tankers, and if both of those prices go up, which reflects at the pump, then the amount of VAT paid goes up too, etc, etc, etc. Basically, it's a highly interconnected formula where changes in one area can potentially affect all the others. Oh, and the final interconnected piece of the puzzle I'll mention is the currency situation. You may have cottoned on to the fact that I've been doing the price per barrel of crude oil in dollars, and that's because the crude oil barrels are sold and bought in dollars. So when the pound is weak in comparison to the dollar, our prices are higher and vice versa. At the moment, the pound is very weak compared to the dollar, so it's another contributing factor in the price. Now, interconnectedness isn't just relevant to the prices, it's relevant to the impacts too. So if the price of fuel goes up, then the cost for delivery companies goes up, which means that the delivery charges can go up for us as consumers. And that's not just about making an online purchase, that's in-store too. So if you go to a supermarket to get your weekly shop, someone had to deliver the groceries to the supermarket for you to buy. So if it's costing the supermarket more money to deliver those groceries to the supermarket, the way to recoup their cash is to charge more to you, the consumer. The same can be said for taking a taxi or buying items online or taking a flight or whatever it is. If it requires crude oil at any point in the process of you buying the item, the price you pay could be higher. I could go on about this, but ultimately we can't just think about price we pay at the pumps, we have to think about the prices we pay for anything that requires fuel. So that begs the question, how could prices decrease from where they currently are? Well, the first one is that the supply-demand ratio would have to start heading back in the other direction, and the remaining suppliers of crude oil outside of Russia would need to pick up the slack, or sanctions on Russia would have to relax and ultimately disappear. Now, that first point is not possible without massive changes to the infrastructure that oil companies currently use, so it's kind of irrelevant. And that second point is the war in Ukraine likely to end anytime soon in a way that means all the sanctions will go away? I would suggest it's unlikely. Without getting deep into the politics of it, there's no way Russia will want to give an inch, nor the West, and with relations potentially irreparably damaged, there's no certainty that sanctions will end with an end of the fighting in Ukraine or with an end of negotiations. That said, I'm sure many Western economists and political analysts would suggest it's in Russia's interest to negotiate for energy sanctions to disappear, as oil and gas made up 45% of Russian federal budget in 2021, so an inability to sell oil and gas significantly impacts government spending. But at the same time, I'm sure Russian economists and political analysts might suggest the opposite, that it's in our interest to negotiate sanctions down with Russia so we can afford to heat our homes and fill up our cars. Basically, I think a lot of the excess of prices is dependent on how the Russia-Ukraine war ends, and if we end up in a longer term equivalent of the Cold War, then don't expect any overnight price easing. But Russia isn't the only reason for prices increasing, especially given prices were already well on their way up before sanctions came in. So what else could help to ease prices? Well, it's effectively a case of unweaving the web I've just laid out in the previous section. Firstly, the pound needs to be stronger versus the dollar, which means that we need to see a GDP growth here in the UK rather than the expected slump. The Bank of England is scared of recession right now and increasing interest rates to try and combat inflation and minimise the likelihood of recession. Add on our political woes with Boris facing the vote of no confidence and a lot of political and social unrest, and GBP is not looking too hot. That means the pound is down bad in comparison to the dollar, and therefore the price for our fuel is up. The second thing we need to do is decrease the demand for fuel. If fewer of us, not just in the UK but worldwide, need petrol or diesel, then the demand is lower, meaning the suppliers have less of a gap to the existing demand, meaning prices can decrease. Now, I don't think we're likely to do this on our own, as I am well versed in the concept of rational choice theory, which I did my dissertation on at university, and the ultimate rational actor, or the free rider, is the one that expects everyone else to do their part and doesn't do their part. If you want to hear more about that, check out this video from 9 minutes in for a full explanation. Instead, it requires government intervention to make people use less fuel. Germany has already done this, offering everyone a €9 per month ticket to use any form of public transport over the summer. So you could take a train anywhere in the country at any time, and all you have to do is pay €9 a month. With fuel prices super high, this surely means more people who will take public transport as it's so cheap, reducing the demand for petrol and diesel. Now, here's a horrible stat for you. London, Manchester and Birmingham are the 3 most expensive cities in Europe for public transport. Imagine therefore the impact of a UK-wide cheap monthly public transport ticket that could reduce our dependence on petrol. I for one would 100% get involved and reduce some of my car trips to take public transport more. The third and final piece is whether the government intervenes further for the sake of us living through a cost of living crisis and reduces fuel duty a significant amount, and obviously way more than the 5p they already did, to keep the price of fuel stable at more reasonable levels. The problem is, what is a reasonable level, and what will the impact of that be on government spending in other areas? It's a hard one to balance, and it could have the potential downside of encouraging more people to drive, thus increasing demand, thus making the supply and demand equation even worse and keeping us stuck in this situation for longer than we need to be. Basically, I'm very glad I don't have to manage the situation, but something does have to be done. So when will prices start to decrease? Well, with what I've been saying, it's not going to ease anytime soon. I would say our best bet currently is a favourable end to the conflict in Ukraine, as not only could this have the greatest impact on the supply of crude oil, it could also help to ease the general cost of living crisis we're facing here in the UK, give us back some more money into our pockets, increase spending by people, and ultimately put the UK back into a state of decent growth, and ultimately give GBP the bump it needs from a currency perspective. That would probably be the best case scenario for us, but it's almost impossible to predict when the conflict will come to an end and then what the outcome will be. The only way we'll see an immediate overnight reduction would be if the government cut fuel duty and VAT to negligible levels, but as I said, that may have longer term consequences for the prices of fuel in the UK if it means demand stays high. Basically, without major intervention or major luck, don't expect prices to dip anytime soon just naturally. I would expect them to flatten out to whatever level balances supply and demand, and we're already seeing signs of this at the time of making this video, but flattening out doesn't mean we'll return to cheap prices. If we know that supply isn't going to increase anytime soon, we need to artificially decrease demand as best we can. I don't know how to conclude this video, it's a bit sad to be honest. I would love to complete it by being optimistic and suggesting there's an easy way out, but being completely real with you as a massive car fan and someone who loves to drive his car just for fun, I honestly hope the government does something to incentivize more of us to take public transport as much as we possibly can, where we possibly can. Of course, for many people driving is essential, but where it isn't essential, I think whichever country you live in, for this brief moment, even if it's just to give more leverage against Russia, we somehow need to decrease our dependence on fuel. Will that happen? Probably not, but that's pretty much all I can say to you. What are your thoughts? I'd love to hear them in the comments down below, and let me know when you think the current fuel crisis might end. I'm obviously happy for you to disagree with me and my opinions about this, but please do keep it respectful in the comments. Do hit like if you enjoyed this video or found it interesting, I'd really appreciate it, and subscribe as well if you're new here. Massive thanks to the patrons as always for their support, and to you guys as well for watching. I'll see you in the next one.
Listen.